Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the New South Wales Policy Professionals Community of Practice webinar series. As host of the meeting today, I'd like to welcome you all and acknowledge this land as Aboriginal land, wherever you may be joining us from. Rachel, I expect you'll be on Ngunnawal land, and I would like to welcome you as well. I'll just give a brief introduction and then I'll pass over to you. It's very exciting to have Rachel with us today. I think she is our first speaker from the Australian government. We've had international speakers and private sector. We've even had the odd premier, but never had the opportunity to hear from the Australian government. So this is a fantastic new take on policy capability. Dr. Rachel Bacon is the Deputy Commissioner of Integrity Reform and Enabling Services at the Australian Public Service Commission. And she also serves on the IPA ACT Council, where she has promoted excellence in public administration. Rachel has worked in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet as Deputy Secretary, Public Sector Reform, and helped shape, we might get people to turn their mics off, thanks. And where she has helped shape a suite of reforms aimed at making the experience of the public service simpler and better understood. She's also led the Commonwealth's regional cities, local government territories functions as Deputy Secretary in the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications. And she's also spent time running the Department of Energy, Environment and Energy in Policy Analysis and Implementation Division, and as Deputy Chief Executive Officer with the Northern Territories Government's Department of the Chief Minister. Rachel's PhD focused on administrative law and organisational change, if you're wondering, and Rachel has also led a number of task forces to deliver whole of government priorities in environmental regulation and Australia's engagement with Asia, as well as strategic projects on counter-terrorism, native title and refugee law. So I can't think of a better credentialed person to speak to us. Very pleased to have you here, and I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you so much, Louisa, and thank you very much for having me. It's a real privilege to be your first. I can't believe your first Australian government speaker at your community of practice, which is a great initiative, by the way. So huge congratulations to you, Louisa, and your colleagues for hosting what is such a great initiative across the New South Wales Public Service. And it's great to see so many people online. So thank you for your time today. Louisa, I'd just like to join in your acknowledgement of country. You're absolutely right. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country. Very kind of humbled and privileged to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's chilly on Ngunnawal country, but it's really beautiful this time of year with surrounded by mountains, and a privilege to live and work here. Also like to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us on the call. Look, it's fantastic to be able to talk about policy capability. It's a topic that's really close to my heart. You would have heard from some of the things that I've done in the course of my career. There's been a lot of strategic policy kind of woven through in the course of my career, and it's great to be in the Australian Public Service Commission where we're focusing a huge amount of effort on capability. And so that kind of my deep interest in policy and in capability kind of coming together in some of the work that we're doing in the Commission and also to deliver the government's public sector reform agenda. So I'll talk a little bit about the broad and then kind of bring it in to the specific as we go through. So I might just get some help to share my screen if I'm pressing the right button. This one. Okay, so I'm just checking, Louisa, that people can see my screen.
All good from my end, thank you.
Lovely. All right, well, I'll kind of just start very briefly by giving people a little bit of context of what I've been doing and kind of the broad landscape around public sector reform and the things that we've been working on with the government on its APS reform agenda. So I'm just seeing if I can move to the next slide. There we go. So I won't spend too much time on this, but I did want to just give a flavour of some of the things that the Australian government has come into government after the election in May 2022. The government came in with a very ambitious, very large set of commitments around public sector reform. Now, interestingly, public sector reform has been a recurring feature of public administration at the Commonwealth level really since 1901. And it's fascinating, under the Public Service Act, there's always been a requirement under that legislation since the 1920s for the Public Service Commissioner, who was actually one of the first statutory appointments in the Commonwealth, to give a report on the state of the public service. It's fascinating to see the kinds of capability that in the 1920s, the very first report of the Public Service Commissioner focused on capability and workforce management issues, because there was something like 800 telegraph messenger boys in the public service in the 1920s. And there was a real issue on how do we manage our telegraph messenger workforce? They all have to retire when they're 18 years old. How do we retain and attract some of that talent? There were regional issues. They worked right across Australia. And there was questions of how do we kind of retain and grow our capability from that cohort kind of into the future and across the service. So these issues around capability, workforce management, geographic dispersion, etc., have actually been issues right through the last century into the present day. So there's a long history of public sector reform at the Commonwealth level, and I know a lot of states have also kind of gone through periods of really focusing on public sector reform in different jurisdictions as well. And there's a lot that we can learn from each other and continue learning from each other. And I do think some of our work around policy capability is one of those areas. I'm going to talk a little bit in a bit more detail about that as well. But to give you a really quick tour, the government came in, as I said, with a lot of election commitments in the area of public sector reform. Minister Gallagher, who is the Minister for the Public Service, helpfully for us, also the Finance Minister, very senior minister in our Executive Expenditure Review Committee, so one of the senior kind of central ministers in government. She has laid out basically the government's reform priorities for public service reform, and you can see them there. It's about the APS, Australian Public Service, having an integrity in everything it does. It's about putting people and business at the centre of our design as well as our delivery. It's about the public service being a model employer. And it's also about the public service having the capability to do its job well. So underneath those four pillars of the government's reform agenda, where we've got up to 60 different initiatives that we're delivering, and really what we're embarked on here is a 10-year transformation agenda to really seize the window of political opportunity that the current government's given us to strengthen, improve, and make sure that the public service is the best that it can be as a modern day service, serving government, the parliament and the public. In terms of how we've gone about this, I won't go through this in detail, but essentially the point I wanted to make on this slide is that we've put a huge amount of work in to building an implementation platform or a delivery platform with the implementation and governance architecture that we've built to deliver the government's public service reform agenda and effect change across a 180,000 person organisation. Now, we don't have the scale of New South Wales in terms of your teachers, nurses, etc., but it is a large organisation across every part of Australia and affecting change in culture, in mindset, and in capability, we think is absolutely necessary to deliver the impact and the outcomes that we're trying to seek through the public service reform agenda. Now, it is really hard to affect culture and mindset shift across an organisation as complex and diverse and geographically spread as the Australian Public Service. But we do think capability is something we can absolutely tackle at a system-wide level. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we're doing on capability, because this really frames what we're doing around policy capability. And so this is I guess, gives you the conceptual framework at a whole of system level on how we're really focusing in on that pillar 4 of our reform agenda around capability, and how we're trying to tackle that both for our individual staff and at a whole of system level. And that's where some of our work on policy capability comes in that I wanted to share with you today. But what you can see, I affectionately call this our capability triangle. I'm a very visual person, and I like thinking about in concepts. That's why I love doing policy work so much. But the reason I like this is it really tries to explain all of the different levels that we're trying to impact all at once to increase capability across a very large, complex and diverse system that has multiple cultures and subcultures operating within it. So the way that this triangle works, it's a little bit like, for those who are familiar with risk work, it's a little bit like the risk triangle, that really at the bottom of that triangle, you really want the coalface of every team in every organisation in your system working to affect the change that you're wanting to see, whether it's better approaches to managing risk and a risk culture and risk mindset. In this case, it's better approaches and a more focused, mindful effort on capability uplift. So at the bottom of that triangle, we're really talking about every single member of staff who works in the public service needs to have a performance agreement with their supervisor that focuses on their development. And this is really saying at the coalface, for teams who are doing their business as usual on the job in every function across government, we want people to be really mindful of what good performance management looks like, to be doing performance agreements that really focus in on the right skills for them. And we want our supervisors and our managers to be doing the basics really well in terms of developing skills and core skills. As part of that, we've instituted a new SES performance framework that is consistent across the whole of the service. So every SES across the Australian Public Service will have a shared approach to their performance agreements, and that should hopefully cascade down through the service through all teams. So we think we're trying to get ourselves to a position where we can leverage all of that work across the service to promote individual skill building, which is also relevant from a policy perspective, where we want to really promote that strong growth in policy capability, from all our staff at all levels in an organisation. When you go up the triangle, we're then at the next level talking about local responses that are aimed at developing capabilities and skills that are important in individual departments or important for the particular functions that different departments and agencies are developing. Agency learning and development teams and our HR teams are really important in this space. They will often have their L&D strategies in individual agencies that are really crafted around what does this agency need to be delivering. We at the Australian Public Service Commission, we have the Australian Public Service Academy within the Commission, and that really is looking at what are the programs and offerings across all functions across the service that we can offer and support agency teams who are trying to lift capability in targeted ways appropriate to the operating context of those agencies. In a lot of cases, that will also include policy capability. When we then get up to the partnership approaches and targeted interventions, these are really things where we've got a gap. It's a system-wide gap. It's not isolated to just one department or one team in one department. We're actually seeing a recurring pattern of a capability gap that needs more systemic intervention to address. And so in that third level in the triangle, we're talking about things like our Capability Reinvestment Fund, which is an initiative under the Public Service Reform Agenda, where we've done 2 rounds of funding under that fund, where we've targeted in each round 5 core capabilities. And when we open that round, we invite applications from all departments and agencies. We require them to collaborate with each other and encourage joint applications where departments have collaborated to fill capability gaps and focused on areas of particular need across the system. In our latest round of the Capability Reinvestment Fund, we've included data integration and policy skills as one of our 5 focus areas, and got some interesting, innovative proposals back throughout all of the focus areas in that fund. The next level is targeted intervention that secretaries identify, and integrity. For anyone who's been following some of the really challenging findings and outcomes for us around the Robo-Debt Task Force, the Robo-Debt Royal Commission, we've got a lot of work underway across the system, across the service, to tackle integrity, and how we build capability on integrity is one of the focus areas that's subject to targeted intervention. At the top of that system, we've got things really that only secretaries can drive at a whole of system level. We have been talking to secretaries about policy capability at a whole of system level. That's an early-ish conversation. I'll get into that more in a minute. But other system level interventions we're focused on are ICT capability, and where we keep poaching our own on ICT capability, we've kind of shifted the approach and said, at a whole of system level, how do secretaries drive an uplift in ICT capability so we're not cannibalising each other, and we're actually using the market power of the Commonwealth Public Service more effectively to compete in a very internationally and domestically competitive labour market for ICT. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of the structure and how we're trying to organise ourselves to tackle different capability gaps as we see them, both current gaps and emerging gaps into the future across the system. All of this is supported by really strong data, which is also so important when we're talking about capability, but we've got really good workforce data that we're pumping out across the system about labour force data, what's happening in labour markets, in particular areas of capability need. So how does all of that apply to policy capability? So in terms of why policy capability is important, you guys will know that. There's a reason that you're all part of this community of practice. It's such an important part of the public service, providing that frank and fearless advice to the government on how to handle some of the most complex, rapidly evolving challenges that we face, whether it's in New South Wales or as a nation. Often those issues get quite mixed together in terms of the nature of the challenges we're facing and the nature of the solutions that we need to tackle them. The policy challenge that we've seen, and it's actually for more than a decade that we've been conscious of this issue around policy capability, becoming increasingly important to be able to tackle the really complex and wicked problems that government is needing to tackle. It feels increasingly, I'm sure there were always complex problems like in the 1920s with those telegraph boys, but the nature of the issues we're trying to tackle now are so complex and kind of integrated problems where so many different moving parts and levers, both international, domestic, across 3 levels of government, across all sectors. So I think that policy capability is increasingly important to tackle increasingly complex policy challenges. And at the same time, it's an area that we've identified of increasing need. We've had reports like the Thodey review into the Australian Public Service, massive review, over 11,000 submissions and engagements went into that review. And that's really informed the current government's public service reform agenda. We had an earlier review of the public service in 2010 ahead of the game. Both Thodey and ahead of the game reports in the Australian Public Service really did call out a decline in policy capability and talked about a hollowing out of strategic policy skills. And there's been a lot of talk around that as part of the reform agenda in terms of rebuilding critical and core skill sets in the public service, including a concern that those have been hollowed out due to increasing use of consulting firms, for example. So there's been a fair bit of analysis into what do we actually need to focus on when it comes to strengthening policy capability across the system as a whole. And some of the drivers we've set out here and kind of grouped some of the drivers here, I guess. So that first kind of thing we need to tackle is around capability. So it's how do we build not only individual capability, which was the bottom of that capability pyramid, but how do we also build organisational capabilities around the skills and the knowledge and the tools that's needed to do really good policy. There's technical skills, there's tools, there's methods, there's knowledge of policy processes and how you navigate a policy through a complex process within government. And these processes are complex and challenging with multiple competing views, both inside and outside government. There's obviously skills and capability around understanding context, around understanding stakeholders, and a huge world of tools that when you wield those tools well can really assist with policy work. So there's a whole set of not only individual capability, but also at an organisational level, the understanding of why those skills, technical skills and tools are important and why they should be embraced, welcomed and nurtured at an organisational level, not just training our individuals. They need to come back to an environment that embraces the new tools and skills that people have learnt when they go off and get their training. So that's one area of focus. The other is capacity. By this, we mean the availability of resources, so time and people, to do high quality policy work. We know that things often are always urgent. Our ministers can identify an issue and want it solved yesterday. I think we've all experienced that. But it does take time and people to do really good quality policy work. So how do we carve out some of that to do these things well? The other piece we've called out there is culture. So what is the way that we do things? When we get those really strong urgent demands from our ministers, from how do we make sure that the leadership in the service, the leadership in our departments is actually demanding quality evidence-based policy analysis and advice? And how are we really embedding the behaviours within teams that drive that real laser-like focus on quality and evidence and rigour in analysis, and I guess the frank and fearless nature of where an idea might not work, how do we call that out? So there's a culture piece in all of that. And the last piece is around the formal structures, systems and processes that support good policy development and advice at a whole of APS level, as well as at a departmental level. So that's how we're trying to think about tackling this challenge of building policy capability. There's a huge amount of work going on at the moment within portfolios, so within departments and agencies. There's been some good work done in capability reviews, which is one of the APS reform initiatives that we've restarted capability reviews. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But we're seeing some really interesting actions falling out within departments who are developing policy capability curriculum for their staff who are in policy roles, implementing those things through performance management systems, forming things like senior strategic policy forums within their departments. So some good initiatives at individual department level. Also across the APS, there's some specialist areas that we've cultivated. I know New South Wales has some great capability as well in some of these areas. We've tried to build kind of specialist areas that can then work across government on issues like evaluation with the Australian Centre for Evaluation, Australian Government Consulting, that initiative for an in-house consulting capability, which is based in our Prime Minister's department, has a lot of the tools in their toolkit that they then share when they do consulting projects across the Australian government. And then the behavioural economics team that we've set up in the Prime Minister's department, and I know you have a really impressive capability like that in New South Wales. So we're really trying to invest in specialist capability and then with tools and methodologies and think about how do we deploy that across the system more broadly. Then we're thinking about how do we do work at a whole of system level. So in those upper parts of the capability triangle that I mentioned, the Australian Public Service Academy is a really strong institutional mechanism that it's only a few years old now. So that's been around since 2019. But it provides a lot of tools, resources, as well as courses to support policy capability development. And one of the courses that was commissioned by secretaries actually as part of the public sector reform agenda through an improving policy capability project, that resulted in a course that we call Delivering Great Policy. It's a practitioner-led course. I've been a practitioner doing teaching through that course, which is really aimed at kind of senior middle managers and really take them through a highly structured approach in how to do great policy work, but in a multidisciplinary environment where we bring together people, practitioners from different departments and agencies to really hone their craft on policy capability. So we're happy to share any of the kind of tools and things that we use in that Delivering Great Policy course. And we've put a lot of effort into that. And it's great to see practitioners kind of being involved in the teaching of that course across the system. So in terms of, that's kind of some of the things we have been doing. In terms of some of the things that are in the pipeline that we're kind of working on moving forward in relation to that uplift in policy capability, there's that kind of more training that we're investing in around, how we scale some of the policy development capability initiatives that are going on in different departments, and how we can open up existing training from specialist areas. So we'll be focusing on that throughout the rest of the year. We do have some really great strategic policy capability in pockets in different departments. The real question is, how do we scale it across the service as a whole? We're looking at our toolkit, our methodologies for doing policy work. There's some interesting tools we're drawing on with some of those specialist areas that I talked about in terms of behavioural economics and evaluation. Our in-house consulting capability is another great example of where we're really trying to hone our toolkit for doing policy work and kind of spread that one project at a time, and then back that in across the system with the APS Academy and their training in the same tools and methodologies that our in-house consulting capability is using when they deploy on individual projects. So we're really trying to kind of get different parts of the system working together, particularly around a common set of tools and methodologies that people can use for great policy work. We're working on how we address cultural and behavioural barriers. It's great having the behavioural insights team to help us work with that, and thinking about how we can improve structures, this idea of embedding evaluation to really back in evidence-based decision making is something we're also working on across the service. So that gives you a flavour, hopefully, of our current work. I mentioned capability reviews before. This is actually an initiative that has come out of the public service reform agenda to reinstate a program of capability reviews. It's exciting for us that we actually got amendments through our Parliament just a few weeks ago, and that included a requirement to do capability reviews. So that's now actually in our legislation. Capability reviews we've kind of piloted an initial set of capability reviews. It's got a defined methodology around it. It looks across all domains that departments need to do well to make sure they've got the right capability to deliver into the future. But that includes looking at strategic policy capability. So it's really focused on continuous improvement and making sure the public service has the skills that it needs into the future. After a capability review, each department will look at the findings that it sees out of its own capability review, develop an action plan that is then published. So if people are interested in the capability reviews that have been done to date. You'll be able to find information about those on the Australian Public Service Commission website, but you'll also be able to dig in and see what insights came from that around policy capability in those individual agencies. Interestingly, we are seeing, while it's still the early days of the program, we've done just 4 capability reviews so far, including the Commission, which is one of the guinea pig first cabs off the rank. But one of the interesting kind of patterns that we're seeing coming out of capability reviews is actually around policy capability. So specifically, it's around strategic or integrated strategic policy capability, which is emerging as a bit of a pattern and theme out of our capability reviews. So some of the examples of the capability work that's underway in individual departments has actually been driven by the findings in these capability reviews. And so, for example, we've got our Department of Infrastructure that's developed that policy capability curriculum for staff that I mentioned before, and they're kind of flowing that through their performance management system. So that's an example of action that's been taken in response to findings in capability reviews. Our Department of Health has set up a senior strategic policy forum for their staff, again, to drive policy capability out of findings in their review. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of some of the things we're doing across government. I did just want to end by talking a little bit about, I guess, a bit more personally about my own experiences, having worked as a Northern Territory public servant, having worked as a Commonwealth public servant, having spent, when I was in the Northern Territory, probably, 70% of my job was COAG, now National Cabinet. But what I got the opportunity to do there is work on a lot of really wicked policy challenges in that COAG environment that you could not solve in any one jurisdiction working on its own at all. Like, these challenges are just too complex as policy challenges, where you need levers from multiple parts of different systems to come together in an aligned way to affect the policy outcomes that you're trying to achieve. What I wanted to share with this group, and given that Australian government, New South Wales government, are we coming together on policy conversations, is my experience of the power of collaboration across levels of government when we collaborate on policy work and policy problems. And this is born out of my own experience, particularly in the Northern Territory, where we were trying to tackle issues like early childhood. We had issues around competition policy agreements at the COAG level, and we had, a really big present challenge when I was in the Northern Territory on how we rolled out the NDIS, particularly in remote communities like East Arnhem Land. What we did with each of these challenges, we recognised that the NT, particularly NT, is very little and has not many resources, as maybe in a public service of 20,000, there were maybe 200 of us who did policy work when I was in the NT public service. So really little, punching above its weight a lot of the time. But in areas like early childhood or competition policy, we didn't have all the levers. So for early childhood, we actually did a joint project with South Australian Premier's Department, South Australian Education Department, NT Chief Minister's NT Education Department, and Commonwealth Education Department. We actually ran a project on what would it look like to expand preschool to 3-year-olds. We did that as a collaborative project with a little bit of a remote task force working on that policy problem together. Similarly, when the competition policy agreement was up for consideration by COAG and treasurers were working on it, we were really worried about how does competition policy work in thin markets or not work in thin markets, or what are the perverse outcomes that can happen when you're trying to push competition policy in thin markets. We did a joint project with your Treasury and Commonwealth Treasury, Northern Territory Treasury and Chief Minister's Department, actually really unpacking how do you make competition policy work and how do you implement it in thin markets. The third one that I'll just touch on in a little bit more detail was how do you roll out the NDIS in a place like East Arnhem Land. And to give you a little flavour, there's just a photo of us at CAF when Michael Gunner, as the Chief Minister, was Chair of CAF. But we did a fantastic project where we brought together Prime Minister's Department, Department of Social Services, the NDIA, and the NT Health Department, our local government department, as well as the Chief Minister's Department. And we had a secondee from Prime Minister and Cabinet. And we actually decided to tackle that problem of how do you roll out the NDIS well in remote markets, because you've got all of these problems around place-based delivery of disability services, which is hard because people from remote would often have to travel into Darwin to access services. You've got really thin markets in terms of thin workforces. So how do you get the workforce to deliver a market-based set of disability services where you've got no workforce in remote? And then you've also got kind of a other side of the coin problem in remote of people do not have access to job opportunities. And so you've got entrenched intergenerational unemployment, disadvantage, and all of the social challenges that come with that across the social determinants of health when you don't have employment opportunities in remote and really thin markets. And so we really tried to bring both of those complex policy problems together and think about where you've got that rollout of NDIS, how does that actually become an opportunity to promote training and workforce opportunities in remote communities, both to tackle the workforce challenges of a competitive disability market in thin markets, and to give place-based employment and training opportunities with a pipeline of training opportunities in really thin markets in remote communities. We took a group of Commonwealth public servants out to Elcho Island, which was great, a little island off the coast of East Arnhem Land. They sat down with disability providers in that community and heard firsthand what are the impacts, of what does a move to a disability market have, implications have in those communities. And, just being able to talk to people to say, when you have employment, when you have participation, and there are specific examples on Elcho Island after a cyclone hit, and you had community-built housing as part of the rebuild in that community, rates of domestic violence plummeted to almost zero. When you had community working on opportunities, employment opportunities like repainting houses. And then as soon as that project finished, rates of domestic violence went back up to where they had been before that project started. So it really gave, I think, our Commonwealth colleagues the opportunity to hear firsthand what are some of the challenges on the ground. That wouldn't have happened if we hadn't have partnered on a project across jurisdictional boundaries and actually brought all of those perspectives, different practitioner perspectives, different local perspectives together to solve what is actually a problem that plays out nationally in thin markets for the NDIS. So I'm really proud of the work that we did in that project, but I'm particularly proud of the way that we did it, because rather than having positions lined up on other sides of the table around a COAG meeting, where everyone's trying to hammer out and come with their kind of fixed position, it was actually flipping the model. It was getting people on the same side of the table to work in a same joined up team on a really hard policy problem, bringing multiple perspectives, multiple levers to think about how do we tackle that really complex set of problems in what is a shared challenge. And so I would just really, endorse or kind of ask people to think about that way of working, because it is rare that we have all of the levers to tackle the policy problems that we're asked to tackle in our work. The very last thing I'll touch on, and this is my last slide, is around the APS Academy that I've mentioned a few times. This is really how we think about building capability across the public service at that system level. The APS Academy really thinks about public service craft, and you'll see that policy capability is a really important part of the public service craft. So it's an embedded core skill that we see as part of the craft that is unique to public servants and to public service outcomes. We also have a real focus on practitioner-led learning. So I mentioned in our Delivering Right Policy course, we get practitioners to come in and actually for policy experts to train people in doing good policy. Little bit, the analogy we're starting to talk about more and more is the analogy of a teaching hospital, where at a teaching hospital, every moment in a teaching hospital is a moment to teach. We don't have that mindset in the public service from our senior leaders and our really experienced practitioners, and why not? So we're really trying to bring a different mindset into how we think about practitioner-led learning on the job. And I think that's just so important on policy, lifting policy capability, because we've all got war stories of what worked and what didn't in different policy exercises. So that practitioner-led learning, we're really trying to open up opportunities for practitioners to actually contribute to learning experiences for our more junior staff. And the last point there is about a networked approach. No one department or agency has all the answers, has all the tools, has all the capability. So this is really about how do we network across the service and use the academy to connect people up to different specialist capabilities across the service and kind of lift all boats, I guess, right across the system. So Louisa, that's where I was going to finish. I hope I haven't gone on for too long, but I'm happy to share the slides after the session and really happy to kind of be involved in a discussion if anyone has any questions or observations. Thank you.
Definitely, I'm sure there will be a few questions. And if you do want to ask a question, pop it in the chat and I'll coordinate. We already have our first question lined up, but before we get started on those, I wanted to highlight some of the critical points that you made there, Rachel, and I'm so pleased to hear about all of the thinking that's gone in from the Australian Public Service Commission on this, because it's so fabulous and we really need to emulate it in New South Wales. As you point out, we do have some really great capability, but the ability to leverage that and share it is probably something that we need to learn from. And we often talk about the policy process being the thing that will give us better policy. And actually, I think we've been remiss in actually thinking it's the policy capability that our staff have that give us better policy. And we really need to invest in that as much as anything. So I do have a few questions myself, but our first question is from Siva Ganeshan. If you would like to turn on your camera so we can see you, introduce yourself, and so we can see you. Great, thanks.
Hi, Rachel. It was thanks so much for the presentation. It was great also to see examples from the territory. I grew up in Darwin, so it was really nice to see the way you were going through the case studies with principals from different disciplines, and it wasn't focused on one discipline. So I thought that was really interesting. You kind of touched on the question that I have on the APS Academy on your last slide. One of the challenges in New South Wales, and I've been involved in a couple of communities of practices, it's hard to get the resourcing and the steam and the backing to embed it in something that is that can be sustained. And doesn't take away from people's other roles that they do have that they're being paid for. So if you could talk a little bit more about APS Academy around how it was established, the resourcing, the thinking, whether it's relatively new or it's well established. And then there's always self-interest in these questions as well, whether you're going to also be thinking about providing these kinds of courses in the APS Academy, whether they're thinking of providing it to policy professionals in other jurisdictions.
Thanks so much for your question, Siva, and great to see someone who was born in Darwin too. It's a lot warmer there at the moment. So with the APS Academy, that was an initiative that was really, started to get ahead of steam and be established around 2019. So there's a series of outcomes out of the 30 review that I mentioned, a really comprehensive review of the Australian Public Service, probably the most comprehensive since the Coombs Coombs' work back in the a few decades earlier. But the Academy was really about having, I guess, a concentrated effort and a platform, and building the infrastructure. You know, I guess the human capital, the focus of effort around having that infrastructure that can be service wide, and actually really focus on making capability easily available and accessible across the system rather than in individual pockets. So really concentrating effort on learning and development and capability uplift was the purpose of it. So it hasn't been around all that long, 2019, not that long ago. My colleague Shubho Banerjee, who runs all of the capability work in the Commission, he has the APS Academy as part of what he does. It's a really well thought through approach. Whenever I hear him talk about it, I kind of learn more about what they're doing. But it is based out of the Australian Public Service Commission. It's not a physical building. It's more an academy that is a collection of partnerships. It has a brand, so it's easier to find and is recognisable. And it kind of auspices a lot of different learning and development partnerships, whether it's with different universities, whether it's drawing, you know, other providers of capability from the private sector, from in-house capability from departments. It draws together a whole lot of, I guess, learning and development opportunities, and seeks to make those available across the system as a whole. So there's a number of leadership programs at different levels, for example, that we run through the Academy. We've recently been targeting cohorts of our First Nations staff and kind of First Nations staff coming into the public service for the first time, and kind of investing some capability through the Academy there. In terms of how it's funded, that is an excellent question. We kind of look a bit enviously at Singapore. The Singapore Civil Service have probably the most mature that we've seen around the world in terms of they've got their Civil Service Academy. They kind of almost have a mandated every department will contribute X amount to their Civil Service Academy. We are not quite that locked in terms of funding streams, but secretaries believe in it, and secretaries actually pay a subscription as well as course fees. They actually pay a subscription, so they give up some of their budget because they can see the value and the benefit of a whole of system approach to some of this capability work. So it is a really interesting model, and secretaries have backed it since 2019, and they continue to back it because they see the value. In terms of offering courses to policy professionals in other jurisdictions, I will take that on notice. I will come back to Louisa out of session. I think the most relevant to policy professionals is that Delivering Great Policy course. It was co-designed with policy officers across the whole of the service. 15 secretaries kind of supported the development of the course through that task force that set it up. The materials are excellent, and like having taught at that course a couple of times as a practitioner, it's a great learning environment too. So we'll kind of take that offline and come back through Louisa to share a bit more detail about that. I don't know if we get other public services joining. It kind of might overwhelm us a little potentially if there was strong interest, but let me find out. And if there is interest through your community of practice in, you know, if we don't do it on a regular basis, but can we kind of get some people so you can kind of suck it and see if it's something you want to do in your jurisdiction, then I think that would be a great thing to collaborate on.
Thanks a lot.
I think that sounds fabulous, and very looking forward to having that further opportunity. I did tell Rachel that I thought we'd have a few members looking a bit green in jealousy at some of the work that the Australian government's doing. So I'm sure you'll share that emotion with me, and hopefully we'll be able to see what we can do there. We now have, and one of the things I thought was really great about your presentation, Rachel, is that you highlighted the importance of with your triangle of the work that we can all do to improve our own capability, either individually or with our colleagues or with our staff. And Nanda Kumar has a question on that. Nanda Kumar, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Thanks, Louisa. Thanks, Rachel. I've got a bit gruffy voice because of the winter that's affected my health. I hope you bear. I'll keep it short. I'm going to give you an example here, Rachel. Like we have a system here, and I work in the transport department. We have a system called Transport Equip. We capture what you said in the bottom, and then in that, we have a labor costing, and where they say how much time you've spent on meeting it all. So I'm saying at that point, if you have include mentoring, coaching, minimum 3 hours a month at various levels, from director to senior manager to manager to all the grades flowing down, then it's kind of a double entry. And then if you blow it up to the whole of New South Wales, Public Service Commission New South Wales will get a picture. Why I am saying this is this mentoring and coaching is a hands-on approach. While I appreciate what you are saying, Rachel, you're running policy seminars, policy courses. What at entry level people want, like APS 6 or 7 and above, when they want to have a career pathway or growth, is this hands-on approach. Look, for example, okay, here is it, Mike. I'm training you in Cabinet Minute, how to write a Cabinet Minute. Say some tools processes. Okay, I'm here going to getting you to engage in a policy framework. How do you develop that framework? The pillars in that. And the third one is here is an artifact for you to fill in to learn the process for stakeholder consultation using the RACHI method. Like, for example, I'm just not being very specific. So that is how you build. And if that is into that system, you get the metrics. And if you go to the whole of government approach, you can make things wonder. And this will bring accountability in the public service on both sides. Because how you learn is the 70-30, 70-20-10 method. I'm a firm believer in the 70% hands-on approach. That is something, incidentally, I want to tell you this, that I've been in public service for the last 28 years. That is why I'm saying all these things from my experience and conviction. Okay. So therefore, if that is included, people will develop a lot. In my own capacity, I've been telling youngsters who have been joining what you require if you want to build conversations or they come and approach me and all. So therefore, I'm saying if this is systemized in the performance management system that you talked about at the last in your pyramid, which is fantastic. The presentation, 4-5 slides is very good. I like it. We need to build, but then at the level to build the growth, this mentoring and care coaching should be included in that, captured in the data that you're talking about as evidence, and then which will bring accountability on both sides. To be very honest with you, Rachel, this, whatever system they are having, people think it is only a tick and flick. Oh man, you call me in February, then half-yearly management, then. But if you have this kind of mentoring capability, establishing accountability, you are building a system, a capability. Okay.
Nanda Kumar, I couldn't agree more. And everything you're saying is what we are trying to get to. We are absolutely not there yet. Like this idea of that I mentioned of the teaching hospital, there's a mindset that goes with that. It's a mindset about, in those settings, as I understand it, for clinical practitioners, every moment is a teaching opportunity. And that is how things are approached. And I think there's a mindset that goes with that. So your 28 years of experience, I mean, that's an incredible amount of corporate knowledge that you can give as a very generous gift to those around you when you're looking at every moment as a teaching opportunity. So we have not cracked this yet, but I think it's a really nice way of articulating what we are trying to get to. The fact that in professional, busy settings with high impact, high risk, you can absolutely have a teaching mindset and still deliver what you need to deliver. So, I think it's something we aspire to. And then, talking about our performance systems, that's the way that we can capture it and kind of have the accountability and all of that. But I do think it starts with a mindset challenge. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you, Louisa.
No worries. Because we've got a few minutes left, I wanted to focus on some other issues that you touched on. I think in the last few years anyway, and we're now reaping the consequences of this, we have deferred some of our policy capability to the private sector. And I think we're now realising what that means for our public service. When is the right time to use consultants, Rachel, in your view?
It's a great question, Louisa. We've actually done a piece of work which should be on our website as well, called the Strategic Commissioning Framework. And that actually is guidance that all secretaries have signed up to and help shape of when you should and shouldn't use consultants. And then where every department is going through an exercise at the moment of setting identifying their core work. So we define core and non-core work. Core work would be things like writing a cabinet submission. You should not use a consultant to write a cabinet submission. So that's one of the principles in our strategic commissioning framework. But then there's other work that is core work for some departments that is not core work for other departments. So our Chief Government Consultant, Andrew Knipe, head of our new Australian Government Consulting Service, which is in-house within PM&C, he talks about rare repeat projects, where a project is rare, but it's repeated in different departments on an ad hoc basis, but you can see it happen, on a reasonably regular basis across the system as a whole. They're the times when you might want to reach for a consultant. And they're exactly the types of times that we're trying to deploy our in-house consulting capability into, so that you kind of don't always have to go external for that type of work. But those core capabilities, every department's in the process of defining what theirs are in their operating context and setting targets for basically when they will kind of, I guess, scale down and not be relying on consultants to do that core work. So that's a major outcome that our minister is wanting to deliver through the APS reform agenda.
And that sounds really interesting. And we've also been considering the role of academics. I think slightly different issues, obviously, have their own, bring their own strengths to policy conversations. But then there are some similarities with considering, what should be in-house core work for the public sector and what is expertise that can be brought in from time to time. We have
Louisa, I know you need to finish, but on that kind of academia, the UK Innovation Hub is really interesting as that interface between academia and policy departments, and they are an interface that connect up between those things. Their model's fascinating. So if anyone's interested in that aspect, I would really encourage looking at the UK model.
Great. And I do want to get to one last question from Taliska asking about regional issues, and I think you're a great person to ask that question to. So yes, please ask your question.
Hi, Rachel. It's been a while. We worked together back in Department of Chief Minister when I was just freshly minted as a graduate. So I just have a question. I now work in Department of Regional New South Wales, and considering the scale and geographic spread of the APS, were there or are there any specific nuances or additional needs that you have identified or had to overcome when providing capability uplift to policy professionals regionally and in remote areas?
It's really lovely to see you and so nice to see familiar faces. Yeah, look, I've spent a lot of time thinking about regional policy. Interestingly, a lot of our policy capability actually tends to be based in Canberra, or it's Canberra-based teams that have remote workforces. And so we might have, in my regional policy team, for example, I had people working from different parts of the country, but based, I guess, focused on a team that was in Canberra. So we do still tend to be a bit more Canberra-centric when it comes to our policy work. I reckon the big challenge to overcome with that is how do you actually get that lived experience injected into your policy development? How do you understand what's going on the ground? And it's why when we did the NDIS rollout in East Arnhem, actually taking, Commonwealth public servants to Elcho Island and facilitating the opportunity for them to sit down and talk directly to service providers, people with disability, people in the community about what that meant for them at a local level, it brings, and then bringing that back into those, capital city-based policy processes and injecting the lived experience and depth of understanding into that, it just deepens the understanding of the issues and the potential solutions and what is actually going to be implementable on the ground. And we know that implementation is absolutely critical to think about up front at the beginning of your policy development cycle. So I think a real issue that we can all actually actively tackle, no matter where we work and what we work on, is how do we think about that data step in the policy development cycle? How do we think about what data we're collecting? Is it desktop? Is it quant? Where we're trying to lean into qualitative data, how are we doing that? Do we have any lived experience data in the mix? There's cutting edge methodologies around lived experience. We are not yet kind of across how to make best use of them, but how do we get different voices into the data kind of collection piece in the policy cycle? That would be, I think that's a shared challenge for all of us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Visca.
Thank you very much to our audience and to Dr. Rachel Bacon for your time today. I'm sorry we've gone a few minutes over, but it was such a good discussion and I wish we could have had more. So thank you very much again for your time, and thank you to our audience for their interest and enthusiasm in policy. And I will be taking a short break over the school holidays in July and be back in August. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Bye.